What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view one of the world's most powerful economies. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this crisis could reshape the entire global economic landscape. China's transformation has been nothing short of miraculous. In just 4 decades, this nation went from being among the world's poorest countries to becoming an economic superpower on track to overtake the United States. But as prosperity grew, something unexpected began happening beneath the surface. A strange phenomenon emerged that could quietly unravel decades of progress. The problem isn't what you might expect. It's not corruption, political instability, or international sanctions. The issue is far more subtle yet potentially devastating. Nobody is spending money. While American consumers spend nearly all their income, saving just 5% annually, Chinese citizens are saving at 8 times that rate, hoarding over 40% of their earnings. This might not sound alarming at first glance, but here's the critical detail that changes everything. Chinese families aren't saving by choice. They're saving because they have no alternative. Now China appears to be paying a devastating price for this economic behavior. Following the spectacular collapse of real estate giant Evergrande in 2021, the government launched ambitious efforts to transform China into a modern consumption-based economy. Despite these efforts, they have failed completely. Here's a staggering comparison that reveals the depth of this crisis. Despite having 3 times the population of the European Union, China consumes only half as much. This means the spending that supports businesses, generates tax revenue, and creates employment simply isn't materializing. The very factor that once powered the Chinese miracle is now silently strangling their economy. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to stay ahead of global economic trends that affect us all, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because understanding these shifts gives you a massive advantage in predicting what comes next. And your support helps us bring you more deep-dive investigations into the forces shaping our world. So what's actually happening within China's economic system? And is there any solution that could reverse this downward spiral? This is the story of how the Chinese economic miracle is transforming into a potential nightmare. This crisis didn't emerge overnight from nowhere. To understand why China finds itself trapped in a spending crisis, you must comprehend what this country was originally designed to accomplish. China's economy wasn't built for comfort, consumption, or lifestyle enhancement. It was engineered for one primary purpose: to catch up with the developed world. During the 1980s, China was emerging from decades of isolation, devastating famines, and political chaos under Mao's regime. The nation's GDP per capita was less than $200. Even adjusted for inflation, this would rank China among the world's most impoverished nations. When Deng Xiaoping opened the doors to market reforms in 1978, his goal wasn't creating a modern consumer-based economy. He was focused on preventing China's complete economic collapse. Unlike other developing nations, China simply didn't have the luxury of dreaming about shopping malls and consumer goods. Every available resource had to be channeled toward transforming the economy into an industrial powerhouse. This meant pouring resources into building factories, investing heavily in infrastructure, and crucially, saving money for future investments. While Americans were purchasing televisions, microwaves, and second cars, Chinese families were saving every penny they could accumulate. In the early 2000s, the average Chinese household was saving over half their income. The average American household was saving around 5%. When a household saves money, those funds don't simply sit idle in bank accounts. They flow through financial systems into loans for factories, investment into infrastructure projects, and mortgages for housing development. Thanks to this enormous pool of household savings, China was able to invest trillions into their economy. By 2010, investment into physical assets accounted for nearly half of total GDP growth. For several decades, this strategy worked brilliantly. In just 30 years, China lifted over 800 million people out of poverty. That represents almost 15% of the world's entire population. Chinese cities exploded in size and complexity. Villages became factory towns, and factory towns evolved into massive megacities. As concrete poured and ports expanded rapidly, China became the world's largest exporter, the top steel producer, and the backbone of global supply chains. One industry more than any other fueled this unprecedented growth: construction. By 2010, construction activity made up nearly half of Chinese GDP growth. Meanwhile, the housing market was experiencing explosive growth. With property prices rising by over 15% annually, the average Chinese citizen didn't need to increase their spending dramatically. As long as the construction industry continued expanding, there was sufficient money flowing through the economy to maintain momentum. When developers borrowed money to build projects, it stimulated banking sectors. When they purchased land, it provided funding for local governments. When construction commenced, it created employment opportunities and generated demand for raw materials. Even with relatively weak household spending, the constant building cycle kept money circulating throughout the economy. Nobody seriously considered what might happen if the real estate market crashed. But then catastrophe struck in 2021 with the collapse of Evergrande, one of the titans of Chinese real estate. For years, this company had symbolized China's economic boom, owning everything from luxury residential towers to professional football clubs. Beneath the impressive surface lay over $300 billion in corporate debt. When Evergrande defaulted on its obligations, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Tens of thousands of families were left with unfinished apartment purchases. Construction projects froze mid-development across the country. For the first time in decades, property prices began declining significantly. The one asset the middle class believed was completely secure, their family home, had suddenly become a financial liability. During any economic crisis, consumer spending becomes the lifeline that keeps an economy functioning. When businesses collapse and investment capital dries up, it's consumer demand, everyday people buying goods and services, that maintains economic circulation. The government rushed to revive spending through multiple channels. They cut interest rates, offered generous tax breaks, and pressured banks to increase lending. Despite these efforts, none of the stimulus measures worked effectively. No matter how aggressively the government intervened, Chinese consumers simply refused to spend their money. China found itself completely stuck in an economic trap. The very mechanism that had once fueled spectacular growth now trapped the economy in persistent malaise. You might think the Chinese Communist Party, arguably the strongest government in the world, could implement solutions to restart consumer spending. At least for now, all their efforts have failed completely. Household savings in China reached a record high exceeding $20 trillion, which surpasses the entire GDP of the European Union. Almost 5 years after the crisis began, the country still hasn't achieved meaningful recovery. Economic growth rates have fallen to their lowest levels since the 1980s. The real reason behind this stagnation might not be what most people expect. It all comes down to a strange feature of Chinese society that might be quietly destroying the economy. The issue is rapidly collapsing birth rates, creating a demographic crisis. By 2040, more than 25% of China's population will be over 60 years old. That represents hundreds of millions of elderly citizens with a shrinking working-age population to support them financially. Older populations tend to save more money and spend significantly less on consumer goods. China's demographic time bomb is already altering economic behavior patterns. Younger families are saving aggressively to care for aging parents, while elderly citizens are hoarding cash to fund retirement and healthcare expenses. This means less money flowing into the economic machine that drives growth. The real problem isn't just the increasing number of elderly people, it's the complete lack of systematic support behind them. A rapidly aging population might still spend money if they had confidence in the system supporting them. In China, that confidence simply doesn't exist at meaningful levels. This might sound strange considering the country claims to operate as a socialist state. In reality, China's welfare state is extremely weak and underdeveloped. Health insurance coverage is limited, public pensions are modest, and even when households have disposable income, there's insufficient structural support to spend with confidence. All of this places enormous pressure on the country's young people. Rather than focusing on their own financial needs, their money must support parents and even grandparents. Many young Chinese are deciding this financial burden is simply too overwhelming to bear. Instead, a new coping mechanism has emerged called lying flat. Young people are opting out of high-pressure employment altogether. They aren't joining the economy actively, they're stepping back from participation entirely. Youth unemployment in China quietly surged past 21% before the government stopped publishing employment data in 2023. That's 1 in 5 young people with no job, no income, and no clear path forward economically. Picture a university graduate in Chengdu, burdened with student debt, receiving job offers that don't cover basic rent, and facing expectations to provide for their entire extended family. For a generation that was promised prosperity and success, This feels like a broken contract with society. Many are simply opting out of the entire economic system. This creates an extremely dangerous situation that feeds into a vicious cycle. Experts estimate that long-term household consumption growth will likely slow to around 3 to 4% annually over the next 5 to 10 years. At most, consumption will contribute around 1.5% of GDP growth per year, which is insufficient to power a modern economy. Without robust consumption, companies stop making new investments. When companies stop investing, they stop hiring new employees. When hiring freezes occur, unemployment rises across all sectors. When unemployment increases, even more people stop spending money. Economists call this phenomenon a deflationary spiral. When prices across the economy begin falling consistently, this might initially sound beneficial for consumers. However, it signals something much deeper and more troubling. Demand is weakening systematically. Consumers aren't holding back spending because they're satisfied with their current situation. They're restraining spending because they're deeply uncertain about the future. The longer this cycle continues, the harder it becomes to reverse course. People postpone major purchases indefinitely. Firms delay expansion plans and new investments. Confidence erodes not because of one dramatic shock, but from a steady accumulation of pessimism. This is what makes deflation so economically dangerous. It doesn't explode dramatically, it sinks gradually and persistently. Normally, this is where fiscal policy interventions would prove effective. Governments typically bridge spending gaps with their own large-scale projects. This includes investing in infrastructure, creating public sector jobs, and distributing stimulus payments to maintain economic momentum. China doesn't really have this policy option available anymore. After years of overbuilding, overborrowing, and repeatedly bailing out failing sectors, the government is running out of fiscal headroom. The official budget deficit reached a record high in 2023, exceeding 4% of GDP, the largest since the 1990s. That figure only represents what's officially recorded in government books. China's local governments are also deeply indebted, much of it tied to land sales that are now drying up because nobody wants to build. In 2024, the Communist Party was forced to raise the ceiling on local government debt by 6 trillion yuan, approximately $800 billion, to cover increased financial pressure. When local governments exhaust their financial resources, the impact on citizens is immediate and severe. It means reduced funding for public services, decreased investment in community projects, and less capacity to provide social welfare. These are precisely the things that might restore enough confidence for people to start spending again. China isn't just another economy competing in global markets. It's the second largest economy in the world, and virtually everyone relies on what China manufactures. Nearly 30% of global manufacturing takes place within Chinese borders. China is the largest buyer of raw materials including iron, copper, and coal. It's also the biggest exporter of electronics, machinery, and everyday consumer goods. When a manufacturing machine that enormous starts seizing up, the rest of the global system begins feeling the effects. Global supply chains have already been significantly impacted. Fewer factories operating in China means fewer components available for manufacturers in Germany, Mexico, and Vietnam. Even the most technologically advanced sectors aren't immune to these disruptions. China controls nearly 70% of global rare earth metal exports. These materials are essential for manufacturing everything from electric vehicles and semiconductors to advanced military equipment. If production output slows or becomes unpredictable, it won't just increase prices globally. It could severely constrain the very technologies that the rest of the world is trying to build its future economy upon. In our interconnected globalized economy, China's internal economic freeze threatens to become everyone's problem. Today, China sits at a critical crossroads that will determine its future trajectory. For decades, their economy has been an incredible engine for prosperity and development. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, transformed farmland into industrial zones, and became the factory supplying the world. But that same economic model, built on investment, savings, and construction, is now cracking under its own enormous weight. People aren't spending money on goods and services, companies aren't hiring new employees or expanding operations. Young people are quietly opting out of economic participation entirely. At its core, this isn't merely an economic or financial problem, it's fundamentally a question of trust and confidence. Trust in employment opportunities, trust in the welfare system, trust in the future itself. Right now, that essential trust has been broken across Chinese society. The Chinese government faces a crucial choice that will shape the nation's destiny. They can rebuild confidence by creating robust social safety nets, loosening tight economic control, and shifting power toward households and consumers. Alternatively, they can continue propping up a system that appears strong externally but is slowly sinking from within. Here's the uncomfortable truth that global leaders must confront. An economy as massive as China's doesn't need to crash dramatically to cause a worldwide crisis. It just needs to stop growing at the pace the world economy depends upon. And that's exactly what's beginning to happen right now, with consequences that will ripple across every corner of our interconnected global economy. The strange problem that terrifies China isn't just China's problem anymore. It's becoming the world's problem, and the clock is ticking on finding a solution.